Hello, and welcome to a special post-election episode of Accountancy Insights. My name is Iain Wright. I'm Managing Director of Reputation and Influence at ICAEW. The general election on Thursday, the 4th of July, saw the Labour Party take power with a landslide victory. Now it faces the same challenges that successive governments have found difficult, if not impossible, to tackle, that of kickstarting the UK economy. With the promise of 20 bills being introduced in the new government's first 100 days, something we may see in the King's speech on the 17th of July, it appears the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and indeed the new government are keen to hit the ground running. But with little room for manoeuvre in the public finances, can anything move the dial when it comes to boosting growth?
Keir is hoping that steadiness and maturity will win over people. The big worry is that actually people don't notice stability. They don't thank you for appearing to just be competent.
I'm glad I am not the Chancellor having to make these decisions, but hard decisions do need to be made in terms of the forward look of the UK economy.
To discuss what we can expect from the new government, I'm joined by two familiar faces, Francis Haque, Chief Economist at Santander UK, and David Williamson, Political Editor at the Sunday Express. Hello both, it's good to see you again.
Thank you, and you.
So, David, can I start with you? Let's recap last week's events. General election, new Labour government, landslide. Just how seismic was the election?
It was extraordinary. It almost feels as if there's been an extinction-level event because Portcullis House is the centre of Westminster. Just imagine a giant Starbucks. It's where MPs go on their way to vote, and their offices are above it or in the adjoining buildings. And over time, you're used to seeing the people wandering around saying hi, and it's the sudden realisation. So many people have gone. There were record numbers of people standing down anyway. And then you just have so many big beasts. It wasn't just the Red Wall people who knew they were in for a fight in the Conservative tribe. It's the people in the heartlands as well, in the Cotswold Shires, who had pretty much assumed that their seat was as safe as a House of Lords seat. Well, this election has been a bold reminder that when you unleash democracy, incredible things, astonishing things can happen.
Francis, the set of circumstances that the new government's inherited. The new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has said that any new government, and of course she is now in number 11, would inherit, and I think I'm quoting here, the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. Would you agree with that? And what do you think she's talking about? Do you think she's talking about the state of public finances and actual nature of the UK economy as well?
Yes, I definitely think it's a bit of both. I mean, if we maybe take the UK economy first, actually, she's been quite lucky because it looks like quarter one, we obviously saw good growth. Quarter two is looking promising. So maybe inheriting an economy that is at least starting to grow rather than stagnate, which is what we've seen, obviously, in the last couple of years. So maybe a benefit in that respect, but still, it's an economy that needs to be restructured. And they've got a lot of work to do in order to be able to do that. And that will take time. I mean, in terms of the public purse and the fiscal position, I mean, things are fairly dire. They've obviously got very limited headroom to do anything over and above, what we've seen. And the one thing that perhaps is worth pointing out, because I'm not sure that people understand this, but part of that headroom, that tiny headroom that was left at the last budget, is based on actually quite strong growth rates by the OBR. And if they're not achieved and they are above our sort of normal average growth rates, then there's even more of a problem for the Chancellor as she moves forward. So very interesting position. And of course, the spending commitments, which is a big question mark, was, of course, over, the last 6 weeks. Everyone was talking about it, and I don't think anybody really answered those questions. So that, I think, for us as economists in particular, and those trying to work out what's going to happen next, is a really interesting question. So I look forward to seeing what the outcome of her review is that she's commissioned, and then what she decides to do for the budget.
David, Francis was saying, we've started to see good news. I think this week quarterly GDP growth is much higher than expected. I think it's 0.4%. At ICAEW, we've just released the results of our latest business confidence monitor, and business confidence is at its highest level now for 2 years. and there is an anticipation, an expectation of interest rate cuts later in the year. Why on earth did Rishi Sunak, given that the economy is going to get better in the second half of the year, why did he go to the country so early? What was he thinking?
I've spent the last few weeks asking every Conservative I meet that question, and there's an honest look of bafflement on a lot of people. Those that don't particularly take a warm view of Rishi say that the expectation was that the Rwanda flights wouldn't get off the ground, that there would have been more legal challenges. That then would have opened up the potential of a very nasty split amongst ministers about the ECHR and such things. That's taking a very dim view. There's also a theory that he has been terrified about the number of people coming off fixed-term mortgages, and that if this continued into the autumn, that even if they were being told, hey, the economic figures are better, well, actually, household wealth would have collapsed in a lot of households where there would have been a lot of pain. And when the Tories depend on a property-owning democracy, these are the very people that you need to be reaching. But there's the other sense that maybe he just thought that this was an opportunity with inflation finally down, that he could say, look, I'm delivering, give me a new mandate. People who remember the last days of Gordon Brown will remember the attack line of he's squatting in Downing Street. That probably would have been unleashed come the autumn as the kids go back to school and the evenings start to draw in again. And they're like, just get on with it would have been the message coming across.
Francis, you talked about limited room for manoeuvre for the new Chancellor. And when you think about the set of circumstances that she has inherited, the tax burden is now at its highest level since, I think, 1950. But the new Chancellor has said, we will keep national insurance, we'll keep VAT frozen, we'll keep income tax rates frozen. Is this feasible, given what the new Labour government wants to do?
I don't think that they'll go against it to begin with. I think, they've made a commitment, and I think they need to show that they are committed to that. But you do wonder, because there is very limited room for other tax rises that would create the amount of money that you need to really fix some of these issues. So that's why we're all wondering what's going to happen in the budget. But there are probably one or two areas that they can push on. Capital gains tax is obviously one that they've not said anything. They've not committed to not raising it, but that could be one that they push for. But again, the three big money raisers are VAT, national insurance, and income tax. So whatever they do, they're still not going to get the kinds of money that we probably need to throw at the fiscal problem in terms of spending, at least. So that either means they're going to have to be some cuts somewhere, or they're going to have to make some very large efficiencies, which seems fairly unlikely.
I mentioned ICAEW's Business Confidence Monitor, and as I said, it was the highest level of confidence that we've seen for a couple of years. But investment activity remains a real concern, and it seems that business investment is a big structural challenge of our economy. And in order to carry out growth, to boost growth, that we need to have that investment moving. What would you do? I'm going to play fantasy politics here. The Prime Minister has just announced that you, Francis, are the new Chancellor. What are the first things that you do in the Treasury?
It's interesting because if business confidence is rising, that should translate into more investment. But you kind of wonder, I suppose, when I look at it and I think, well, why haven't people invested? And I think part of that is to do with stability. And what was it, the three pillars that Rachel Reeves came up with in terms of growth? She's quite right. The way out of this issue is through growth, but growth takes time. But she was talking about stability, investment and reform. So I think, if we're talking about investment, stability is very important. I think businesses need to have an understanding of things aren't going to flip-flop and change. I'm hoping that we're not going to have yet another Prime Minister. Hopefully, there is just more continuity. And I think that will help from an investment perspective. But I also think that you need to get in there and start reforming. So, it has been good to see the fact that they're getting in there right away with the planning reforms, because that should make a difference. The only thing I'd say is they are supply side. It will take time. But the quicker they start those reforms, then the sooner, you'll get the benefits through. But I do think, at least initially, some stability for firms might just start to boost investment.
David, Frances talked about a couple of things, and I'll challenge her again because that was a very political answer. She'd make a very good chancellor.
Absolutely.
But she raises a couple of really interesting points that we might see happen throughout the course of the new parliament. So at the moment, things are relatively non-controversial. There's a sense of unity on the Labour benches. People are delighted to be elected. But one of the big drivers for growth will be planning reform. The Chancellor made a speech, I think it was earlier this week, about looking to review Greenbelt, reforming the national planning policy framework to boost house building. So what will be the attitude of the new Labour MPs, fresh on the benches? I will agree to, the idea of a growth in house building in principle, but not in my constituency. So will there be a bit of that? Is that going to be a real strain on the Labour benches?
I think it will be, actually. With the Conservatives, they had precisely this problem that here's the party of business, and what is more of a British business than property development, and yet their own MPs in so many areas were horrified by proposals to build next door to their constituents. And one of the problems about having such, you could almost say, excessive landslides, where you almost have more MPs than you need, is that you have more MPs who are going to have problems with development on their local doorsteps. And it is a real issue, because if people have managed to just scramble somehow onto the property ladder, and they suddenly discover that the green space opposite them is going to be filled with high-density housing, well, there'll be a lot of anguish, especially as you have people who have such high mortgages as it is that they don't want to see the value of their houses plummet because of the development next door. And there are a few things as a motive as the green belts, but alongside this comes the other issue of the vast expansion of the national grid that's been promised. Suddenly you have the prospect of pylons appearing, which again is the type of thing which suddenly makes somebody who only thinks about politics once every 4 years start thinking about it a lot, writing to local councillors, getting on Twitter, getting on Facebook, leaving angry comments, "What are you doing?" which is the most terrifying thing an MP can hear. There's a whole host of these issues. Basically, at party conference, Sir Keir Starmer won huge applause by basically vowing to stand up to NIMBYism and bulldoze through obstacles to development. Whether he then finds himself having to bulldoze through the objection of his own backbenchers, that's going to be quite a daunting challenge.
So from an economic point of view, how important is this planning reform, and an expansion of house building? Will that move the dial on growth for the UK economy?
I do genuinely think it will help. It's not going to be the only solution to the problem. They're going to have to do other things as well. But we focus very much on house building, but also actually that includes, as David talked about, the national grid, an expansion of that. So also businesses, trying to look to grow their business and then having problems in terms of being able to do that, which obviously comes from the investment point, because they're not allowed to build on, sometimes it's not even greenbelt land. I mean, it's land that you think, well, what else would you going to do with it? But, there are local objections and it gets stopped. So, I mean, it should be able to move the dial, but I don't think that alone is going to give you growth of 2.5%. So you're going to have to, look at other ways of increasing productivity. And I know we've talked about this before, and I've talked about it a lot in terms of skills and things like that. So it's not just planning. You're going to need to make sure you've got a well-skilled workforce as well, because you need to really push the productivity number in order to be able to get the kind of growth you need to be able to grow us out of this problem, if that's what they want to do.
So let me pin you down on that. 2.5% growth. We haven't seen that for quite some time. What are the things that the Chancellor, the new government, needs to do in order to try and achieve 2.5% growth?
There are lots of different things. We've talked about planning. You need to get investment going. As I said, we need to increase productivity. How do you do that? Well, part of that is investment. Part of that is, skilling your workforce. They'll obviously run across the whole issue around immigration. And what do we do? Do we have to import some people in to help us whilst we're developing the skill sets that we need? And that, I think, might be, I'm sure David would have a view on the thorny issue from a political perspective, but this will be an issue going forward. But I mean, there are other things they can do as well. There's a lot of regulations that they could probably look at. I mean, a lot of businesses say that that's part of the problem. Obviously, there's Brexit and what do they do about trading relations and things like that. So there's an awful lot of areas for them to have a look at. The other thing I would say, and I think they have talked about this, is having an industrial policy and actually trying to champion. I mean, we do so much good stuff in terms of life sciences and, digital and things like that. There's lots of things that we could go after that you could champion. But, without an industrial policy, and we've not had one for some time, it's difficult to know then where you're putting your investment. So, a bit more structure around what that might look like could be very helpful.
This all sounds painfully slow.
Yes.
And if you're a Chancellor and a Prime Minister impatient to get growth, and you're focusing, and I think you've acknowledged this, Francis, on the supply side, we are a services-based, consumer-led economy. And I think David was saying earlier, a lot of people might be coming off fixed rate mortgages, seeing a couple of £100 added to their mortgage bill. We've had inflation at a 40-year high. People are feeling the pinch and still feeling the pinch. To get people spending, to improve the demand, not just the supply, and to do it quickly. Again, you're the new Chancellor. What do you do?
And that's where it's quite tough, because when you look at the growth figures that have just come out for this year, they're really quite strong. I mean, stronger than we had all anticipated. But it's not quite coming through in terms of how is it being led? Because you do need consumption. But we also, on the flip side, if you want investment, you also need savings. So it's getting that balance right. In the UK, one of the issues I think we've had, and I'm talking pre-pandemic here, is that saving rates were actually very low, and that didn't help from an investment perspective. They are much higher now. People do seem to be saving more. Whether that will continue will be interesting, to see. So you have that horrible tension a little bit between wanting consumption to drive the economy, but also needing a certain amount of savings within the economy to fuel investment, which will then, of course, drive growth. So it's a hard situation to be in, because from a Chancellor's perspective, one way, of course, to increase demand would be from a fiscal perspective. But if you've got no headroom to push forward some of that, you've then either got to borrow more or you've got to tax more, but that might not be the right solution. I have to say, I'm glad I am not the Chancellor having to make these decisions, but hard decisions do need to be made in terms of the forward look of the UK economy.
Let's push towards 2.5-3% growth. Why don't we try, in pursuit of that important aim, let's really drastically cut taxes, and perhaps, through some sort of unfunded borrowing commitment. I mean, I don't know whether a Prime Minister in recent years would ever think about that. That's an experiment that simply doesn't work. But should it? Should a Labour government, with a large majority, maybe think about that? Or is that absolute economic lunacy?
I think the markets need to see stability. I think the markets want to know that they're not going to do something that will create issues. I mean, obviously we saw it back when Liz Truss tried to do that. I mean, what she was trying to do was the right thing, but it obviously didn't pay off the way that she did it. So I think, personally, they need to show that they can manage the economy well, and then they'll be given more latitude to be able to borrow more. They will also hopefully have the benefit of interest rates falling, because we do all expect interest rates to fall, and that will then help in terms of obviously people having more in their pocket if they're not having to pay such high mortgage rates and things like that. So they may get a little bit of help from that. And of course, also from a fiscal point of view, they won't be paying so much interest on the debt. I mean, if they're lucky, lots of things will come together for them to put them into a slightly better position to be able to perhaps drive a little bit more growth in terms of consumer spending.
David, Francis was talking about supply side reform and talked about planning, talked about an industrial strategy, talked about skills, workforce development. I've got a short attention span. That's, terribly boring and impatient. I want growth now. But is there an argument, majority of 174, has the Labour Party, the new Labour government, got time to put these things in place? Or do they need to be impatient as well? In order to secure a second term, do they need to get growth now? Or can they be fairly relaxed about this?
I don't think they're worried about people rushing back to the Conservatives quickly, but I think the contrast with 1997 is quite striking, where there were several big policies which had an immediate impact on people's actual lives. I think back to that time I was a student working in a shoe shop during the summers in Northern Ireland, and suddenly the minimum wage came in. That transformed, because we had been paid on commission previously. Suddenly it was like, whoa, just by every hour that you stand here, you're getting vastly more money. And that was a game-changing thing for a lot of people. I remember during the tea breaks, you'd hear staff suddenly talking about this, and that went on for years. You also had the rollout of things like Sure Start centres, which was at the time an incredibly controversial idea, that here is the government telling you how to bring up your children, which in Britain had been, where there's this terror of the nanny state, things like that. It's whether people start to see a direct impact on their lives, because the danger is that they'll go, they're essentially the same. They're a managerial class. And one of the things that people are slightly nervous about is that it was interesting in Keir Starmer's first press conference in Downing Street, where I think in his opening remarks he used the word mandate 7 times, because one of the attack lines that's come at them already is that the vote share is not that great. And it's actually a feature of the first past the post system that, yes, they came first in a lot of parties, but in a lot of seats, but it is spread quite thin. So they can't risk disenchantment setting in quickly, especially as there's now a lot of people who are very colourful and prepared to give very bold visions of what the government should be doing in the Green group, in the Reform group, and, of course, in the reborn Liberal Democrats, who have discovered that bungee jumping seems to be a passport to electoral success. So Keir is hoping that steadiness and maturity will win over people. The big worry is that that's exactly what Downing Street was saying once Rishi had first moved in. And they realised around autumn of last year that actually people don't notice stability. They don't thank you for appearing to just be competent. They want to see you addressing vociferously the issues that they have. And boy, as you're saying, Francis, there's a lot of issues in people's households at the moment where the pinch point is actually getting quite painful.
But I'm going to push you on the final question of this podcast, Dave. I'm going to push you. We've seen the government being in place for about a week or so. There's a degree of, I think, stability and maturity. There's a feeling of competence. And what struck me, whether this is the enthusiasm of new ministers, there's a sense of unity, the likes of which we've not seen in government for quite some time. So with all of those ingredients, plus a majority in excess of 170, the government can pass its legislative programme. But where are the things that we need to be thinking that might go wrong? You walk the corridors of Westminster. Are there any tips as to what, within the immediate impact of success, there's always the start of failure? And it's like, what can we glean from what's happened now in terms of where will this Labour government come off the rails?
Because they have such a huge majority, there is no doubt who is in control of the country. They own Britain at this moment. And there is also no doubt that there's a series of potential crises coming down the line. Water companies is a huge thing. And they're trying to get out the message early that things are broken, that there's a crisis. Doing this also with prisons, which is a huge issue. But all it takes is for somebody who's been released early to commit some horrendous crime, and that entire policy, people won't necessarily be blaming the previous government for not building enough prisons. They'll be saying, who on earth signed this off? And there's a host of things, which of course comes into the planning as well. And then there's also the fact that we are in a very, very unstable geopolitical world, across the Atlantic. It's just a very short while until the November election. Who knows what effect that'll have on international markets and such things. Ukraine is approaching the point where people do need to reach some sort of consensus of what an acceptable endgame looks like. The Baltics are terrified. Defence spending, when is he actually going to be able to get to the 2.5%? Because as we've seen, they're describing it as a cast iron commitment that until it's actually there on a schedule of this is when we're going to be paying this much, this is when we're going to stop seeing a decline in troop numbers, anxiety will only grow.
Francis, I want to come to you because I think David's set a really interesting scenario there, which is if you think about 15 years, we've had a global financial crash. We've had withdrawal from partnership with our closest trading partner. We've had a global pandemic, the likes of we've not seen for a century. And we've had inflation caused by occupation and invasion of a European power. What do you fear in terms of, as a chief economist, what could derail the Labour government? Would we see something like that? Or is it lots of maybe little things, the collapse of a water company, a local authority going bankrupt? What do you think are those events that can really just put Labour's economic policy on the ropes?
There's obviously always the thought of a black swan event. And with geopolitics the way it is, it feels that they're perhaps more likely than not. And that obviously would be a massive test of the government. But actually, it is probably more the little things building up. If there are more and more things that just keep going wrong, but the water companies are a good example. Or, I know that they've said they'll obviously step in terms of the rail companies and things like that, but it could be any one of those sort of things. It just builds and builds and builds. Lots of little things. There's the boats and things like that. I was talking about immigration. That could be something that. But it's that slow building up of all these different things, which is probably more likely than a black swan event. And how do they deal with that? That's where it's important. They need to obviously be on the front foot to be able to deal with these issues.
Francis, David, that was really insightful. I hope our listeners enjoyed that as much as I did. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to speak with you both. I hope you come back.
Joy to be here.
Again. It's early days for the new Labour government, but we'll be paying close attention to the King's speech next week and a fiscal event that's due to take place in the autumn. Accountancy Insights will return in early August. Before then, there will be a new episode of Behind the Numbers arriving later this month. Your regular host, Philippa Lamb, will be exploring diversity and inclusion in the investment sector. And finally, these podcasts count towards your CPD. So make sure to log your listenership and submit it as part of your CPD record. If you listen on the ICAEW website rather than your phone app, it's as simple as clicking the Add CPD button on each individual episode page. Thanks for being with us today.